'Tis the witching time of night. Orbed is the moon and bright, and the stars they glisten, glisten, seeming with bright eyes to listen. For what listen they? For a song, and for a charm? See, they glisten in alarm, and the moon is waxing warm to hear what I shall say. Moon, keep wide thy golden ears. Hearken, stars, and hearken, spheres. Hearken, thou eternal sky. I sing an infant's lullaby. O pretty lullaby, listen, 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 listen. Glisten, 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 and hear my lullaby. John Keats, October 1818.
On the outer rim of Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky, you'll find a lined road winding past plains of trees, grass, and headstones. This lined road is the artery of the cemetery, branching off into various veins, leading to thousands upon thousands of gravesites decorated with expensive rock. These headstones symbolize what once was, who we used to be as a people, who we are today, and who we will be tomorrow. Each name engraved into each headstone in Cave Hill recalls an individual: men, women, children, black, white, Jew, Gentile, and even Colonel Sanders. All measured by their own lives, some long, some short. All flattened by what Charlotte Turner Smith called misery's cure, or the great equalizer, death. One of the more earnest headstones found within Cave Hill remarks a name few know well, but one that is wrapped in legacy and literary connectivity: George Keats.
Keats was comfortable in the city in part because literary people were comfortable in the city. Several of them had visited by that point, and in the late 19th century, the Courier-Journal called on to the fact that a generation was dying out. This generation from the 40s and 50s had been a really lively group, so they began to interview in the late 19th century these people. And from time to time you'll find them remembering George Keats. And they would remember him as himself a lively person, as a person who was very articulate and, no surprise, who was very literary, who was very well read, very well spoken, and very sociable, and a very likable person. So it's kind of helpful that people in the 1890s were already thinking in historical terms. And when they did, one of the people that came into that kind of kindly net was George Keats.
The Keats name today is no stranger to legacy, thanks to two brothers who held the name, John and George. Prior to these two, the Keats namesake was undistinguished and cloudy, due mainly to a lack of documentation. The two brothers rarely talk about their family within their letters or other works, leading some to speculate on their father's possible illegitimacy. John and George were born in Moorgate, London, 2 years apart from one another, in the Swan and Hoop, an inn managed by Thomas, their father. John, the older of the two, was born in October of 1795. George, February of 1797. The boys, along with their younger brother Tom, were enrolled at Clark School in Enfield, close to the Keats grandparents' house, since the family couldn't afford a better school like Harrow. It was after a day of visiting John and George inboard at school when Thomas suffered a skull fracture after his horse threw him out of the saddle and into the main gate at Bun Hill Fields. He was found later that night unconscious and would die the next morning, leaving his wife Frances widowed, with 4 children to care for. Frances acted quickly for herself, marrying another man within 10 weeks of her husband's death, while leaving her children in the care of her parents. 3 years later, she would return without a husband, without any money, heavily dependent on alcohol. John, wanting to go into the medical field, attempted to nurse his mother back into health. He failed, and she died in March of 1810, leaving the young Keats brothers orphaned and abandoned. It is said that John, after returning to Clark's school, retreated into a corner under his desk for several days. It was only George who was able to persuade him to come out and face his grief. The two grew older and found their place in the literary sphere around London, which was just beginning to welcome the rousing, spiritual poetry of the Romantics.
The Romantic Age in literature and art in England began roughly in the late 1700s and extended into the 1830s. Some critics would push it as far as the 1840s. This Romantic movement represented a replacement, in a sense, of the 18th century's interest in neoclassicism and reason. And what replaced those in the Romantic Age were passion, emotion, pathos. In terms of poets, there were 6 major British poets associated with the Romantic movement, and they fell into 2 so-called generations. In the first generation, you had William Blake, William Wordsworth, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In the second generation, you had Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and John Keats. A very disparate group of writers, and it's not always helpful to say that they were a school, because they really weren't. But they did share certain themes, some more than the others. But the Romantic Age is coming after the great age of revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution. So these poets and other writers, in different ways, picked up themes of oppression, of liberty, and a desire for the individual. With John Keats in particular, who is in some ways unlike the other members of that group, he is quite interested in sensuous beauty, and sensuous beauty in nature. Nature is one of those themes that we also associate with Romantic poetry and Romantic poets. For Keats, when he was looking at nature, what really interested him was the contrast and sometimes the tensions between beauty in nature and its transience, and pain and pleasure. And you find these themes particularly in his great odes, certainly in the one concerning the Grecian urn and To a Nightingale.
George soon found himself welcomed by a wealthy family well-versed in poetry, the Wileys. George and John immersed themselves into this type of social life. However, John tended to stray away since he believed these people didn't match his own intellectual standards. George stuck around, not out of spite for his brother, but rather out of love. The Wileys' daughter, Georgiana, had caught the attention of George from an early start. With the help of John, George wooed her with poetry. A valentine written by John for his brother in 1816 was passed off as George's writing, though Georgiana knew who the real author behind the poem was. George and Georgiana announced their engagement to one another 4 years after meeting each other, and married in May of 1818 in St. Margaret's Church at Parliament Square. Within the next few years, John and George would transform themselves into major figures representative of passion and power, respectively. John going from surgeon's apprentice to major poet, George from accountant wholesaler to frontiersman and entrepreneur. John and George's separation stemmed from a difference of passions. George was married, excited to provide for a family, and hungry for economic opportunity. John had grown wary of his medical training, deciding to focus more on writing, which didn't yield much in terms of monetary compensation. Though money never came between them, this dynamic would provide a strain on the brothers' relationship for years to come, and create a financial rift between the two that would be the bane of their kinship in the end. George, claiming a portion of his inheritance and leaving the rest for John and Tom, deemed the amount of money in his pocket inadequate for the capital he longed for. So he and Georgiana decided to seek an American fortune. In the late, hot days of August in 1818, the married couple would find themselves in Louisville, Kentucky, after months of travel.
When Keats first arrived, they were just starting to see the steamboat, that the railroad was nowhere in sight, not even conceived of at that point. So the flatboat. Now the flatboat was pretty smooth coming down the river. You floated down the river from Pittsburgh to the Mississippi and then to New Orleans. If you wanted to come back up the river, then you had a challenge because you had to go against the stream. The steamboat took care of that. But before you had the steamboat, you had the flatboat, and you had to have guys that used a pole to push them against the stream upstream. So transportation, immigration was a real challenge and a real problem. So it took fairly gritty people to come to this part of the country. And when we say pioneers, they really were pioneers.
In 1819, now finding himself a pioneer of the trapezoid in the wilderness, as Louisville was considered at the time, George invested in a local sawmill, multiple steamboats, and had varying levels of business success and failure. In December, George learned of the death of his younger brother Tom, and charted his way back to London. While in England, claiming his share of Tom's estate, he attempted to settle accounts with John. The meeting was strained, especially after George met John's love, Fanny Braun, for whom he did not form a positive opinion. George left London in January 1820. 5 days later, John began hemorrhaging blood. It would prove to be John's final year alive. The poet removed himself from England in search of a better climate, despite knowing that he would never see Braun again. Traveling with his close friend Joseph Severin, he ended up in Italy, where he would later die penniless, deprived of Fanny's love, and in major debt at the age of 25. After John's death in February 1821, George settled all of John's debts from overseas, but was outwardly criticized by all of the poet's closest friends for not being of better help to his brother.